Hey guys, welcome to an interesting video on Wild Rift. So we're back with a tier list for patch 2.6. Now we haven't done a tier list since patch 2.5, but technically speaking, there was only patch 2.5, 2.5a, then it was patch 2.6. There was never actually a 2.5b because we stayed on patch 2.5a for I think over a month because of the Horizon Cup. So technically speaking, it's only 2 patches later that we're doing a tier list, but of course the meta has shifted considerably with the addition of Kayle Morgana, as well as Caitlyn and Jace in patch 2.5a. And furthermore, we also have the Horizon Cup, where, you know, a lot of picks were shown to be better, and some picks weren't picked at all, so I'm gonna jump straight into it with the Baron lane. So, the most 100% picked or banned champion in Horizon Cup, other than Ziggs, is Renekton. So Renekton sits atop the S+ tier. So we've all always known that Renekton was really good. It's just that we just didn't think that he was that good. But turns out that the pro players can show that he is really actually that good. Technically, he was never actually adjusted after that buff they gave on his Q, like one update after he was released, and he was always in the S tier for Baron lane, but just that now he really is that good and he is S+. Mostly due to the Horizon Cup influencing how it goes, but I have also tested him myself and I've always felt that he was really good. I do believe I have one Renekton video on the channel, so you guys can check it out if you guys want to. Fiora and Riven still stays up at the S+ tier. Riven, I think, is a little bit underrated at the moment because after she got a nerf, 5 damage nerf on her Q and a 1 second cooldown nerf on her E, people suddenly stopped playing her a lot, but actually she's still really almost just as good. Like, the nerfs almost didn't affect her at all, just that thankfully her play rate is down, so I don't have to actually ban her in rank most of the time because she's not actually picked most of the time, but I think she's still really good. Now in the S tier, we have Camille. So as usual, I'm only gonna explain those that need explaining. If not, the video is gonna be an hour long. So Kayle is our new addition. Some people say she's S+, some people say she sucks, but in reality I think she's somewhere in between, because the reality of the situation is, as a Kayle, before level 5 you are just like a melee minion. After level 5 you're like a cannon minion, and you need to actually hit level 10 and like 2 items at least to actually be a champion. But when you hit level 10 with like 2 or 2.5 items, you suddenly scale insanely well and you suddenly just destroy everybody, and by the time you hit level 15 with like 3 or 4 items, you will just destroy everybody. So really, Kayle has a big weakness, especially pre-level 5, even post-level 5, pre-level 10, she still has a huge weakness. So in the higher levels of play, it's very easy to exploit, so there is no way I think she can be S+ in my opinion, because it really is way too easy to shut her down. Like in like a higher elo, like say Emerald, Diamond, and above, whichever Baron laner you're up against is going to be a winning matchup, because there's literally no one that loses to Kayle, and all the jungler has to do is recognize that it's a Kayle, gank the Kayle dies a couple of times, and you're really put far behind, and you get to your level 10 2-item power spike a lot slower, and it just isn't good. And when your team goes for like like dragon fights, Rift Herald fights, all you gotta do is you gotta farm, you gotta split push, just get gold, because you're pretty much useless in these fights anyway, and you're pretty much always gonna get flamed by your team anyway. But honestly, Kayle, if you can get to the point where she's strong, she's really good. Sort of like how Master Yi works, but I think Kayle is like even worse than Master Yi in terms of how weak she is in the early game. So, but she is of course still strong in the late game, which is why she's still in the S tier. Now Jace, after they gave him the buffs, I do think that he's actually pretty strong now, especially in his melee hammer form. His range form, poke, really isn't that strong unless you build lethality, but if you build lethality you're going to be way too squishy, so normally you will build a sort of like a bruiser type of build, normally like a black cleaver kind of build, but of course you will throw in a serrated dirk into the mix early on in the build. But Jace is in a pretty good spot. I don't think he's completely busted, but at the same time he is not weak anymore, so now Jace is getting picked and banned a lot more often. Now Malphite, Garen, still staple picks of the top lane, very good tanks for your team, as well as having the Malphite ultimate. AP Gragas actually is pretty good at the moment. Tank Gragas is pretty much dead by this point, so AP Gragas pretty good. Mundo just got reworked, so he honestly, I don't think he's that overwhelmingly strong, but I don't think he's that weak either. He's just a very, very solid tank. But even as a tank that's supposed to be very, very tanky, he really isn't all that tanky. But his passive immunity to CC is really, really helpful. And I sort of prefer the old Mundo way he had a niche of being good against AP damage. So into an AP heavy team, like let's say a Cannon, a Katarina, and a Corki kind of team, that you will be doing really well into that kind of team. But now he's just sort of a standard tank. And personally, I prefer the niche Mundo, but of course I do prefer his new passive, and I do think he's just alright of a top laner, pretty solid, but just not top tier. Darius and Wukong still there. Actually moved Jax up a little bit, especially since the Horizon Cup showed that if you get fed on Jax, there's really nothing much you can do. And Jax did get buffed like a couple of patches ago with his attack speed stacking faster, which really did help him out a lot. Pretty much just a stat stick champion that would just bashes on anybody who comes close. Unfortunately, Irelia, that small nerf, turned out that a lot of people have said that small nerf Irelia has had did actually make a difference, so I've actually moved her down a tier. Now, personally, I don't play Irelia at all, so I can't judge it for myself, but that's from what people say. So yeah, Tryndamere and Graves also moved down a lot, especially Tryndamere. Turns out Tryndamere was not as strong as what everybody thought. He was way overhyped, so and I was like spam banning Tryndamere, but it turns out he wasn't actually that big of a threat. I mean, make no mistake, he is still really good with that buff. He's not like in the F tier or the E tier anymore, but after these buffs, he's like solidly in the B tier, so at least he's playable now. Graves, after getting nerfed like twice in a row, he's still pretty solid, still in the B tier, still alright, but just not that strong anymore. And beyond the B tier, everything else has pretty much stayed the same. So with that, we're going to move on to the jungle. Alright, so now onto the jungle. As usual, Lee Sin's still all the way up there. He didn't get any further nerfs after his W nerf, so he's still pretty good. Kha'Zix also still up there, still really good. Nothing too much to say about that. Nunu and Riven still up there as well. Now Riven has been, of course, picked a lot less, as I mentioned in the Baron lane, but I still think she's pretty good. Rengar actually moves up a tier because turns out even after he got nerfed, his one-shot potential is, of course, still there. And a good Rengar will destroy any squishy target 100% of the time. So Rengar S tier. And Jace, I've actually put in the S tier just because Jace is actually really good at the moment, honestly. Jace isn't typically really a jungler, but if you can play Jace, and if you want to play him in the jungle, he will actually work because his clear speed is actually alright, which is really what you need to be a jungler. And beyond his clear speed being alright, pretty much he's just a solid champion in general, that if you can play him, and if you get auto-filled to jungle, why not just play him as a jungle, probably as a jungle main. You may not necessarily want to pick up Jace just to learn him because he's a good pick in the jungle, but more of like if you are already playing Jace in other roles, then you might want to play him in the jungle as well if you get auto-filled. Now Kayle actually finds himself on the jungle tier list in the A tier. So now Kayle, I think, is pretty much a early game weaker Master Yi, but a later game stronger Master Yi. And honestly, because Kayle jungle is sort of really unorthodox, some people don't even know that you have to invade the Kayle jungle like how you can invade the Master Yi. Pretty much, if you get invaded, your life is a living hell, and you just have a horrible time in the early game. But if you are undisturbed, which actually happens very, very often, maybe not in the highest of elos, but actually happens really often because Kayle jungle is just so weird of a pick that people just leave you alone and you just farm. Suddenly you come out of the jungle level 10, 2 items, and suddenly you destroy everybody. So Kayle jungle actually might be actually sleeper OP, but I think when people pick up on Kayle jungle, it's when people start invading Kayle jungle, which is when Kayle jungle is going to drop either out of the jungle meta completely or way down the tier list. Now Xin Zhao, I've actually moved down quite a little bit. He was S tier, so I moved him down to A because I don't think he's really as strong as I thought he was. Yeah, so yeah, rework Mundo actually pretty solid just as a tank in general, because in the jungle you don't really have a lot of tanks. You only really have Nunu other than him. Nunu is definitely the superior tank to Mundo in terms of just a jungler perspective, because he has way better ganks, whereas Mundo is just more tanky in general. So if you really need a tank for your team, like a solid tank, maybe Mundo is the way to go, which is why I think he's still like in A tier. Evelyn's still there because we need a good AP option. Tryndamere, of course, dropping down the tier list just because of how he really isn't as strong as people thought he was. Jack's moving up a little bit because of the Horizon Cup, but in the jungle, he isn't going to get as much farm, so it's going to be a lot harder to carry on Jax from the jungle. He's way better in the Baron lane. The rest of the tier list stays pretty much the same. The only new addition is Morgana, who is actually a viable jungler. Now, the thing about Morgana is her clear speed is actually decent. She takes objectives really slowly, so you can't solo a Herald or solo a Dragon very easily unless you have a ton of time. So she does take objectives really slow, which is kind of a downside. Her ganks are like alright, to be honest, but the problem is her ganks kind of rely on hitting her Q, and her Q is a very slow moving projectile that is very easy to dodge, so she's probably just better played in other roles, but she is still a viable jungler, so she sort of can be a flex pick. Like if you learn Morgana, you can play her mid, jungle, and support as well. So she's kind of just there because she is viable in the jungle, and she really isn't all that bad, to be very honest. But I still think her other roles are better. She might even move down further, maybe because normally when champions are new, they generally are rated a little bit higher, but sometimes with time they might be rated lower. But pretty much that's about it for the jungle. Now we can move on to the mid lane. Right, so onto the mid lane. Now mid lane meta has shaked up quite a bit, and now Diana is back up on top. Now you would have, you probably would have known that, like I think in patch 2.4 or 2.3, Diana was like the top of the mid lane, and now she's back up there just because she's really good, and a lot of the other mid laners got nerfed, or they just simply aren't as good. Zed, in my opinion, is really strong at the moment. He just got his Edge of Night. He still has the Sereldas, and he still can one-shot anybody, and a good Zed player can navigate the laning phase and just roam and assassinate people non-stop. So in my opinion, Zed is S+ tier. Ziggs just drops down from the S+ tier because of his nerfs, but he's still really good. So he is still in the S tier, but just not S+ anymore. Galio, just because he's really good counter pick to basically anybody in the S and S+ tier, except for like Zed or like maybe Kayle and Jace. But even against that, he really isn't that bad because he's still pretty tanky. Akali's still very solid. Orianna, Katarina still really solid. Kayle actually finds himself in the S tier as well for the mid lane, just because same logic. If you can survive the laning phase, and if you can get through it, you can actually just scale into the late game. And mid lane, there is a debate on whether Kayle mid or Kayle Baron lane is better. Now there are arguments for both, because mid lane you are in the middle of the map, so it's very easy to get ganked by junglers or other laners, but on the other hand mid lane is very short as well, so it's very hard to freeze lane against a Kayle, which means it's a lot easier for Kayle to farm as well. So in my opinion, it pretty much just balances out. So I think in both roles she is still pretty okay. Now Jace mid is pretty alright as well, just because of how good Jace is in this current state after he got buffed. So I think he's just a solid S tier pick, not like S+, not broken or anything, but he's just a very solid pick even in the mid lane. Because his matchups in mid lane honestly aren't really too bad. There's a lot of melee matchups like Galio, Akali, Katarina, Zed, which he will do pretty good against, and Kayle as well. And he doesn't really have a lot of bad matchups. Maybe Ziggs, because of his like range poke, but his matchups are pretty good in mid, so he's pretty solid in mid as well. I've actually moved Corki down because I've actually tested Corki myself, and I don't think he is as strong as I thought he was, but I still think he's pretty solid, so he is in the A tier. Irelia, still pretty alright in the A tier. Brand and Veigar actually moving down because at this point in time, actually they aren't as strong anymore. Now I always maintain that Brand will always be a good pick in solo queue just because of the lack of coordination and how much raw damage he has, but he has no like escape potential, and he's pretty easy to kill and pretty glass cannon, so probably not what you're looking for in majority of your matches. Veigar has the Nasus problem where he takes very long to scale, and they just buffed his early game as well. But he's just a alright pick. He's not good, but he's not bad. And TF just got nerfed, so he's gonna move down the tier list. And Yasuo's still a pretty alright pick for people who know how to play him. And Morgana is the new addition. I don't think she's that good mid, because I don't think building carry Morgana is necessarily very good. Her Q is mostly CC, her W is just for CC immunity, and her only main damage is her W and her ult. Their W is really easy to step out of unless you stun them into the root them into the W. And the ult is really easy to escape as well majority of the time, and you have to put yourself in danger to use your ult. So I don't like the idea of mid lane Morgana just because of how as a AP carry, you kind of need to like stay safe. Whereas Morgana's main damage is like her ult, where she has to go into the entire enemy team and blow Azanias to actually survive. And her W is very easy to walk out of, so she really has no very good reliable damage in my opinion. So I think she's better played as support. Honestly, I think support is Morgana's best role. Now the rest of the tier list remains the same, so yet again we're going to move on to the ADCs. Now, the ADC tier list has actually shaken up a lot. So now, I am of course an ADC main, so I've played all of these champions a lot because I don't like to just one-trick a champion. I like to play all the different champions. So, honestly, I think Lucian is the best ADC. Now, this might come as a bit of a surprise, but turns out a lot of people who play ADC actually concur that Lucian is really good at the moment. Like, when I play Lucian, I feel like Lucian can destroy people so hard, and yeah, I think Lucian is just very, very good at the moment, surprisingly, out of nowhere. Like, he didn't really get buffed or anything, his items and himself has gotten nerfed, but surprisingly, after he dropped down the tiers, now he's back up. And now Varus, as much as I hate to say it, I think Varus is actually really good at the moment. I hate to say it because, personally, my views is that Varus is a very situational champion, but honestly, at this point, Varus, his numbers are so good that he pretty much is just very solid. He's just safe, he has really good poke, and he has really good wave clear. The only problem is that he doesn't have a very consistent form of DPS because the main good Varus build is lethality, which is kind of more burst oriented, so kind of that's a drawback of Varus. But you know, other than that, Varus is just really good in every other way. His ultimate is amazing for team fights as well, so there is that. Ezreal still really, really good. Still in the S tier. Kai'Sa, actually, honestly, after that nerf on her Q, I thought it wouldn't really affect her too much, but I've played Kai'Sa personally myself, and I really feel that her damage has been impacted by the Q nerf, which turns out a small nerf sometimes really does affect champions, like Irelia's nerf in this patch and Kai'Sa's nerf like 1 or 2 patches ago. I really think it affected Kai'Sa pretty negatively, so she does drop down a little bit. Now, a lot of people saying that she's not even S tier, but I think she's still S tier. I don't think she's A tier. I don't think she's that bad, but she's definitely not S plus anymore. Caitlyn, solidly in the S tier. Now, the main thing about Caitlyn is she has a very strong early and late game, but a very weak mid game, and her laning phase is her strongest part. So honestly, Caitlyn is a must ban for some champions, like for example Vayne or Kai'Sa, because they're pretty much unplayable if there's a Caitlyn on the other team, just because of how much she outranges them, and it just makes the lane pretty much unplayable. And Caitlyn also, her main weakness is like hard engage, which especially with Morgana, it sort of helps her out a lot that Morgana is a very good support at the moment, because her Black Shield will help Caitlyn out a lot. And other than that, Caitlyn is just a pretty solid champion, but I don't think she's broken by any stretch of the imagination, so I don't think she's S+. I think she's good where she is in the middle of the S tier. Vayne, in my opinion, is still really strong. Of course, she is single target, which is her main weakness, but she is still really, really good. Now, Corki, I've put in the bottom of S tier just because he's the only AP option in the, not only, but he's the main AP option in the ADC tiers. I've actually removed Veigar and Ziggs out of the tier list just because of how low their pick rate is in bot lane. So I do think Corki is probably the main go-to AP champion you go for if your team needs AP. So Corki, I think just because of the fact that he's the only viable AP option, will always have a place in the upper parts of the tier list, sort of like how well, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah. So I think Ziggs will always have a place in the upper parts of the tier. Oh, I know I was going there. Sort of like how Evelynn will always have a place in the jungle tier list, just because she's probably the most solid AP jungler. Yeah. So now Xayah, after the nerf she just got, she was probably, I overrated her a lot in the last tier list, so she probably was S tier. But now after the nerf, she's probably A tier, just because of how her AD and her W got impacted. But honestly, she's still a very solid pick, counter pick into like a very heavy dive or assassin kind of comp, because really no other AD carry has that kind of safety, so she is still pretty solid. Now MF actually moves up the tier list by a lot, because the buff on her ult, that 10% damage buff, actually made her ult insane, and her strat, of course, is just the icing on the cake. But really, MF does actually do very well now, especially with like supports that can lock people down, like, you know, like Leona, Amumu, or whatnot. So yeah, the rest of the tier list pretty much remains the same, nothing too different here. Now we're going to move on to the last part, which is support. Alright, so now into the support tier list. Now the first thing I want to kind of mention is that I didn't put Amumu support in the tier list because honestly I think Amumu isn't really a support. He really pretty much only works with Miss Fortune. He doesn't really work with anybody else, so it's sort of like a specialized combo, so I'm not really going to put him specifically as a support. Sort of like when Nasus Senna was a combo, I didn't put Nasus either because pretty much you can only play with Senna, so I wouldn't even necessarily say he's a support. I would say he's like Miss Fortune's support specifically. So now, the support tier list is kind of like a little bit more split up because just because at the bottom tiers, like in the C, D, and E tier, I think that like Soraka and Sona are significantly better than Blitzcrank Pantheon, who are significantly better than Annie Malphite. So I did think there was some distinction. I didn't want to just lump all 6 of them into C tier, so that it kind of looks a bit long, like the formatting of the tier list is a bit long, but yeah. Nami and Lulu still at the top of the tier list, honestly, but Nami's power level going down quite significantly because her wave and her bubble can get negated by Morgana's Black Shield, and Morgana is a very good support. In my opinion, Morgana's best role is support because she provides CC with her root, safety with her Black Shield, especially onto your ADC, and her ult where she can stun the entire enemy team is alright in support, because if you die when you're ulting as support, it's not as bad as if you die when you're the jungler or the mid laner, because the jungler you need the smite, and the mid laner you need to be there for the damage, so that's why I think Morgana's best role is support. And she doesn't really actually build support because she only has her E to shield and heal. She kind of builds damage as support as well, so sort of you're playing mid lane Morgana, like damage Morgana but in support position, so I think this is just the best role for her. Thresh and Senna are still extremely good champions, and pretty much the rest of the tier stayed the same. Pretty much the only thing that changed on the tier list is the addition of Morgana. The rest of the support tier list stays the same. Janna's still a little bit weak because her poke got nerfed. Braum's still very good counter pick into projectile matchups or projectile team comps. Rakan and Leona just very good engage tank supports, and the rest of the tier list is just pretty much as shown. Nothing too much changes. So thank you guys for watching the video, and goodbye.